So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next LMS Center meeting this year. Before we begin, I would like to announce once again that you can follow the LMS Center's program and abstracts for each lecture on the LMS Center's website or on its Facebook profile or on the Facebook profile or Instagram profile of the Department of Philosophy and Social Sciences. I would also like to mention that today's lecture is being recorded, so please use the microphones in front of you if you have any questions. Before contributing to the discussion, please just press the single long button located below the microphone. Anyway, our today guest is Dr. David Černín from the Department of Philosophy of the University of Ostrava. And for today, Dr. Černín has chosen a very interesting topic called From Vodka to the Big Bang and Beyond, the Big History Project and the Philosophy of the Historical Sciences. Dr. Černín, thank you for joining us. And now it's time to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. I have to warn you, this will be probably the first time I was given 70 minutes for my talk. So I am not totally responsible for my time management skills right now. Usually I was giving at the conferences only 20 minutes, but yeah, we will work. I will try to work with that in some responsible manner. And my topic will be focusing predominantly on philosophy of historical sciences. Hopefully I will be gravitating towards the approach from the philosophy of science, and I think pretty soon I will explain you the reasoning behind my title. Hopefully you won't be disappointed. So structure of the talk I will be following. First, I would like to note that there is some particular change in our view of history, that the way we can learn about the past, the way we can present the past, the way we can gain knowledge about the past and influence our present has been changing dramatically in the 20th and 21st century. And there are some interesting challenges that should be addressed by the philosophers. Then I will very briefly introduce some distinction between philosophy of history or philosophy of historiography, or analytic philosophy of history, and philosophy of historical sciences as two distinct philosophical modes of thinking about inquiries into the past. And the most of the presentation will be actually spent on an exploration of a shared framework which would incorporate both history and historical sciences, and could function well as a very good philosophical accounts of these two disciplines. Here I should also mention that I'm coming from University of Ostrava, but we also started just recently new center there, Center for the Philosophy of Historiography, and two of the center members, including the director, Aviezer Tucker, are here in this room with us. So now I will move on. So first, what is this change in our view of history I have been addressing before? And I forgot to start the timer, sorry. I just want to, okay, good. So of course, throughout 19th century, throughout 20th century, throughout a little bit of 21st century, we are just now, we have seen the changes in our view of history to change quite a lot, but I will be addressing one particular change, which is connected to this guy. David Christian is a historian of American origin. He himself used to be pretty traditional historian, and the book he published, for example, in the 1990 is this very nice monography, Living Water, Vodka and Russian Society on the Eve of Emancipation. If you get your hand on this book, it's a rather traditional piece of historical literature. It Well, it's interesting. It basically, you could say that it distills the essence of the topic. It's an interesting blend of environmental history, of economic history, of microhistory, and it basically captures pretty well how vodka and industry around it and politics around it, and taxation and corruption influenced the functioning of Russian Empire in the 19th century. For some historians, it could be considered a little bit bland because it focuses on such a minor topic. No big important historical events, no big important historical characters. But it's as I said, very well distilled blend of various historical disciplines and captures the topic well. So, and by the way, those were all vodka jokes I had for you. So now I can leave this topic and hopefully you are not disappointed. And we will move from vodka to Big Bang finally. Because according to some famous legend, David Christian was shortly after writing this book attending a department meeting and the Department of History, and the question raised in this meeting was, well, where should we start when we are teaching history? At what point we should start teaching history? And Christian answered, half jokingly, we should start at the beginning, at the Big Bang. So everybody laughed and he left the room, but he then decided to pursue this idea, this goal, and went on. Later on, he basically started this something we can call the Big History Project. He published several books like The Maps of Time and Introduction to Big History, or a little bit later this book, Origin Story. And basically everything you need to know about origin story is underneath. I will read it for you. It's a big history of everything, from the Big Bang to the first stars, our solar system, life on Earth, dinosaurs, Homo sapiens, agriculture, Ice Age, empires, fossil fuels, moon landing, mass globalization, and what happens next. As you can see, this is very crazy idea for a book. It's sort of a feverish dream. How are you ever able to capture all of this in one book? Actually, one thing that we cannot blame David Christian for is any lack of writing skills. His books are very well written. They are amusing. He works pretty well with metaphors when he is introducing, for example, the concept of entropy, which is crucial at the beginning of this origin story. He, for example, likens the concept of entropy to a character. How, for example, in a fairy tale, how would entropy look like as a human being? So it's very well written, and it truly starts with the Big Bang. It informs us about the theories about the Big Bang, about different explanation. It tells us a little bit how we learned about Big Bang. It brings forward the evidence, and it continues. And the scope of the story gets narrower and narrower until the moment when the Earth is at the center of the story, then the living beings, then humanity, and then he provides some outlook on the future. These books became very popular and sparked interest in this approach. So many various people followed the suit, and they decided to mimic the project, subscribing to the idea. This, for example, one of the newest book by Brian Wilmore, who is an evolutionary biologist. He wrote The Evolution of Everything, the Patterns and Causes of Big History. It's pretty much the very same story, now written with much bigger emphasis on evolution, and this one is meant a little bit more for I guess it can be used by the universities, but it's slightly easier. It's more textbooky, so I can imagine using it even at some high schools. Well, in general, Big History also invaded history education worldwide. many schools, are actually teaching big history in their courses. It's even being encouraged by politicians. So once again, this idea of big history took the world by storm. There are many projects which are, let's say, big history adjacent, like a deep history project by Andrew Shag and Daniel Lord-Smile. Once again, this is not telling this big story, but it's about expanding our view of the past, looking across much wider time spans and exploring different stories we can tell from this expanded viewpoint. Also, big history received. There is also sufficient literature reflecting on big history, like this book, History of Big History by Ian Hesketh, published by Cambridge University Press in this Cambridge Elements. I'm not a big fan of this book. I think that it reads sort of like a hit piece on David Christian. It's not very fair to him. Basically, the one statement that really irritates me in this book is basically David Christian was just writing about Russian peasants drinking vodka, and then he moved to this big money-making project. Well, it a little bit downplays the complexity of Christian's previous work. And finally, I would like to do some shameless plug-in here that there will be another book coming from Bloomsbury Handbook of Philosophy of Historical Sciences and Big History. We have actually co-edited with Aviezer Tucker, so you can, if you are interested in this topic, you can find this. You can get this book in autumn of this year, hopefully. And so we can see that this big history project definitely caused some ripples. What can we say about big history further? David Christian describes his own project as a modern origin story. He uses these three words. Sometimes he changes them a little bit. Originally, instead of origin, he said a modern creation story or modern creation myth. Actually, all of these words are extremely important in order to understand what you should expect and what should you not expect from big history. First of all, it's a story or myth. It's a simple narrative. It's a story that could somehow be of interest to us. It's not the final story. It's not the ultimate story. It's not any final interpretation of the world. It's just yet another narrative about history of everything. David Christian is very, very clear when he discusses it. He mentions that he always struggles with students, that he wants so that students would understand big history as in a story structure, as a story, not as a final account of reality, but at the same time, he wants them to understand it, not just any other story, but some story that is quite specific, that is actually modern, that it's based on modern science, modern methods. It's written for a modern audience. This is a kind of story that would not be possible for it to exist at earlier times. Also, it's very different. You can take Herodotus' histories. You can take David Hume's History of England. Open it at any point, and you can usually start reading with sufficient understanding. However, in the case of big history, this I think would not be possible because big history books usually presuppose that you have some larger idea, some basic idea about the world and about our current understanding of the world. So it's a specific history book. It's a modern history book, and it's a modern story. It's also origin story, or as I said, creation in the earlier version. It's a story about origin, about where we came from. Actually, the importance of humanity, of our perspective, is very important in big history books. So, and it actually uses something we will actually address later. Let's say approach that the whole book is about inferring the origins, about originary reasoning, originary epistemology. So, in a sense, as I like to rephrase it, big history is basically primeval campfire tales, but now with a dash of science, which I'm not saying critically. I'm simply, I hope I am taking history for what is it, big history for what it is meant to be. We can say we can address other characteristics of this big history. It's a multiscalarity. It constantly shifts the scale. Of course, at the beginning, we're talking about Big Bang. We're talking about extremely violent, extremely massive event that basically created even the laws of physics as we know them. We are talking about the formation of galaxies, planets, suns. And then we slowly are shifting the scales. And we are moving our attention more towards the Earth, towards one planet, one particle, towards one element of this planet, which is life, towards one part of this biosphere, which is humanity, etc., etc. So it's multiscalar. It's also interdisciplinary because David Christian all the time needs to address findings of many different sciences, ranging from astrophysics over geology, biology, psychology, etc., etc. It's one typical property of big history is weak anthropocentrism. While the humanity is not at the very center of the story, it is an important aspect and it is written for humans. The audience is very clear, so there is David Christian is not pretending this is some non-anthropocentric narrative. It is anthropocentric narrative. The book is structured into the threshold of complexity. So basically the narrative threat, you may say, is the increases in complexity. The complexity is that at one point, the complexity on one level becomes so vast that it actually creates new supervening level of complexity, which is not entirely reducible to the previous one. It uses original reasoning, as I said, and it also, when it speaks about the life, he actually uses Dennett's quip that all living organisms are informal wars, that we are basically consuming information and we are acting on information. The concept of information is very important in big history, and it will be important further. Now let's move to the criticism of big history, because this project, of course, is somewhat scary to many historians. Here is a long quotation from Ethan Kleinberg, who is currently, for example, chief editor-in-chief of Historian Theory. He actually, I can read the quote. You can see that he's liking or he's comparing this approach to some failed programs of the past. And this is something that is very often based for criticism of big history. It's some big evolutionary story. It's another evolutionary epic. It's another system that is trying to reduce history of everything to one storyline, to one principle. So it's similar to speculative philosophies of history, according to some to philology, according to some to evolutionary epics. So big history is similar to the failed programs of the past. It also misunderstands history, which should be about intentions, about actions of human agents. It should be about understanding, about interpretation, not about this weird mix of different sciences, which never actually question the motivation of individual agents. And it is also criticized for its reliance on natural sciences, on STEM subjects. Basically, critics like Ian Hesketh or here Ethan Kleinberg also are saying that basically David Christian is writing in this mode only to get more funding, because STEM subjects are preferred by funding organizations. This is a very common trope that appears in the criticism of big history. Furthermore, yet other critics of big history are actually also saying that we should not cross the gaps between history and natural sciences, that these gaps are, for some or other reason, important, that should be maintained, and that should never be crossed. This criticism, you can see how the gaps between the disciplines are not mere empty spaces to be crossed by exceptionally brainy and imaginative people, but are the very spaces of freedom. They should be preserved and cherished for so long as they remain open, like oceans or forests or interstellar space. Thought of a different kind, from a different perspective, on a different wavelength is still possible. Honestly, I'm not sure if I'm convinced by this argument, but and at the same time, I would like to question this idea, because idea of maintaining gaps in history and in sciences also is a bit problematic, because we are used to many gaps in our understanding of the past. Gaps like this gap between history and prehistory, which is also related to the gap between written and material records. This distinction between history and prehistory, it has been used in the past to justify a lot of colonial activities that we definitely do not find ethical today. That history is something, history is something that only civilized people who can write, who have a civilization, who have culture, is something that only they can possess history. They are in some way above the people who have no writing, who are living in some prehistorical state of mind, who are on the level of, who never finished the natural evolution, never reached the social evolution. There are hints of many philosophical conceptions from the past. There are hints of Hegel, but there are also hints of Darwin, Spencer, and others. Okay, so here we see that big history is definitely a new approach to history that caused some ripples, that is gaining interest, and there are some points of criticism leveled mostly from people who are working within the fields of theory of history or maybe philosophy of history. So I want to ask several questions. Hopefully I will be able to somehow answer them during the presentation. First question: do sciences that produce knowledge of the past differ in such a way that we should maintain this gap between natural historical sciences and human historical sciences? What is the underlying epistemology and ontology of sciences that examine the past? And finally, can we bring together philosophers of history and philosophers of historical sciences in order to work within some shared framework? This is something I would like to try to answer today. So let's move on. First, I will very briefly say something about philosophy of history. I will give some very, very brief summary of how it developed throughout 20th century. One very important person among philosophers of history was a British philosopher, metaphysician, archaeologist, historian, and also guy who loved to sail his yacht. Very often, Robin G. Collingwood, sorry. He understood history specifically as a discipline aimed at studying purposive human thought. He brought concepts like reenactment, which presupposes that there is some option how we can actually recreate or relive or understand the thoughts of past agents. And this is what historians do, that they need to look at the historical evidence, be it a text or a tool or development in military technology, and understand it in as some way to answer some question. So it was all about thinking. Collingwood was idealist in many respects. Then, in 1942, Carl Gustav Hempel proposes the deductive nomological model of historical explanation. This is a quite famous paper. Very interesting coincidences of publishing it. It was, I think, first English paper published by Carl Gustav Hempel after he immigrated from Germany while he was running from Nazism to USA. And Hempel has been always working within the field of philosophy of science. He has been focusing on physics quite a bit, but the first English text he wrote was about historical explanation. That was because he noticed how easy it is to abuse the knowledge of the past, and he wanted to give some grounding to describe the act of historical explanation in a way that could be better examined and better argued for or against. His idea, you probably know, the deductive nomological model. Basically, in order to explain an event in the past, you need to know the preceding events, preceding conditions, and you need to know and ideally explicitly form some general laws that govern these events. So you can, from preceding events and laws, deductively derive the event you are trying to explain. However, this deductive nomological model of explanation had its own problems. It showed up to be not very suited to historical sciences. So after the downfall of the DN model, the traditional narrative usually mentions that there was a rise of the so-called narrativist philosophy of history, with the names like Hayden White or Frank Ankersmith. Narrativist philosophy of history shifted the focus a little bit, and it focused predominantly on narrative structures of historical literature. It focused on the books historians write. It was examining its rhetorical dimension, its narrative logic, how the events are described, how they are linked together. It focused on ideological presupposition within those narratives. It focused on different how political views are involved in historical narratives, etc., etc. So you can notice that both Hempel and narrativists were mostly focusing on the level of historical text. Basically, Hempel read some texts of historians. He noticed that they are explaining one event via other events. So he was trying to describe the logic of this explanation. This is actually, both of these approaches are quite different from the Collingwoodian approach, which was more like how historians are arriving at the knowledge of the past. Of course, the knowledge of the actions of historical agents. So there was some shift between those two approaches. And most recently, I think the most recent shift in philosophy of history is a post-narrativist philosophy of history, which is pursued by Jouni-Matti Kukkanen, which is basically urging us to look at the inferential structures historians are using, to look at the history as a discursive practice that is conducted by a specific group of professionals. And I'm actually I really enjoy this shift of focus, and I think I'm very supportive of this idea, but I will also address it, some small issues I may have with it a little bit later. Now let us talk very briefly about what philosophy of historical sciences discuss. Philosophy of historical sciences is basically an offshoot of philosophy of science, and it focuses on the sciences that are dealing with the past. Already in 1975, David Hull identified some of these historical sciences as cosmogony, geology, and palaeontology, but there are actually many others that should be involved among historical sciences. Currently, the philosophers of historical sciences are philosophers like well, David Hull, Cleland, Derek Turner, Adrian Currie, and Aviezer Tucker. Most of the time, I think that the discussions between those two groups, between philosophers of history and philosophers of historical sciences, is very limited. And I think this is something that should be remedied. By the way, the central topics of philosophers of historical sciences are, for example, structure of inference in historical sciences, hypothesis testing in historical sciences, information decoding, problems of underdetermination and competing hypotheses, nature of evidence in historical sciences, trace-based reasoning and analogous reasoning in historical sciences. Those are the topics addressed mostly by philosophers of historical sciences. So now, can we put these two approaches to history into one framework? I will try to argue that we can. So now we will move to the part of presentation when I will be mostly showing some schemes and pictures to you. So let us start with something very simple. When we want to speak about the knowledge of the past, we should remember that there is always past present somehow in our talk. So here is the past. What can we tell about the past? What most of these people actually agree on about the past. So the past is unobservable. Very, very simple. We cannot observe the past. I know that the common example is that, well, when I look at the stars, I'm actually looking at the past because the light traveled for many thousands of years. But I can also say that no, I'm not looking at the past. I'm looking at the light that is coming to my retina right now. So basically, and in order to know that the star I see is basically located in the past, I need to have additional knowledge to make that inference. Also, we can say that the past is, and I'm quoting Joni Matti here, non-narrative and non-verbal in nature. I think I can agree with that. I think that the past is not structured in the same way as our language, and it's not populated by the same entities. We can also say with Polarov that the past is non-standardized, that there is no standard description of what, let's say, species is, what war is, what the Renaissance is. This is something always imposed and created by historians. With philosophers of historical science, we can say that the past is at the same time ontologically overdetermined by the present. Basically, the very fact that I am here means that in the past I probably have to move here from Australia, or that my parents had to meet somewhere or something like that. Basically, the past itself is somehow overdetermined by the present, but our knowledge of that past is, of course, can be still epistemically underdetermined, as Derek Turner would say. And one cheeky quote from one philosopher I will be quoting quite a lot in the following part is that the past is irrelevant to the practice of history. It has no role to play in determination of historical truth or falsity. As you can see, this is very, very, very aggressive, very strong quotation. It can definitely show you that Goldstein is some crazy type of historical anti-realist. And I will get back to him a little bit later, but for now, let's move further and let's draw this thick line between the past and present. So we can see that the past is observable, it's gone, it's not here. We are living in the present, and in the present, how do we engage with history? What is actually this rectangle over the past? Well, we engage with history via some form of historical representation, presentation, construction, narrative, models, theories, whatever. We can actually engage with history in many, many different ways. Here is some book by some Scottish historian called David Hume. This is one way how we can engage with the past. This is a book by Timothy Snyder. This is David Christian's book. Here is Bertrand Russell, History of Western Philosophy. Here are some historical movies like Alexander the Great. Here is some open-air museum. Here is a graph made by Peter Turchin in his cladodynamics research when he's trying to map out the dependence of social complexity measured via governance level on level of military technology. Next to it, you have a civilization tree, I think, as a video game, as a representation of the past. Then you have some crazy guys who are doing reenactment. Then you have actually a radiation background of the universe. And the very last picture, which is a little bit hidden, is actually Darwin's original drawing of evolutionary tree. So all of these things are, by the way, also we can also show a little bit more. As I mentioned, here is David Hume's History of England. This is one example that is a little bit tricky, because on one level, History of England is a historical narrative. It is a way through which how we can, for example, learn about the past, but at the same time, History of England, pretty much because of its age, can also function as a historical evidence for how history writing actually looked in 18th century, and it can tell us something about 18th century, not only about 100 Years' War and something like that, that is actually tackled by Hume in this book. But let us move on. Everything we discussed here, we are discussing contemporary narrative theories, models, explanations, representations, reconstructions, audio and video products, interactive media, maps, visualization. It was quite a big collection of stuff. What we can tell about this level of history. We can say that all of these narratives or types of media are definitely contemporary constructs. They are not exactly the same as the past was. Philosophers of history who focused on this level can, in the past, they, for example, could discuss the explanatory structure, the logic of explanation, or narrative logic, or rhetorical dimensions, different modes of employment, how you create some plot for your narratives, ideological implications, different levels of abstractions in the models, colligatory concepts like Renaissance, which definitely does not have and ask the question whether Renaissance really exists or whether it existed. We can discuss practical considerations, plurality in historiography. How is it possible that there are different interpretations, different stories about the same event? Educational aspects, how should we teach history? Or if we're discussing, for example, video games, we can discuss player agency, as one player is a co-creator of history, co-writer of history, historical renaissance, how these types of historical media actually achieve some history likeness, etc., etc. There are many interesting questions, and I think all of these are legitimate questions to ask for philosophers. Here is a quote from Hayden White, very, very typical, very famous. In this theory, I treat historical work at what it most manifestly is, a verbal structure in the form of narrative prose discourse. So for some philosophers of history, history is mostly this narrative structure that they can discuss. Even Goldstein, who I mentioned as a anti-realist, and who was at the same time a big opponent of narrativists, mentioned that we can do a lot on this level. We can explain the past on this level. We can interpret it. We can contemplate it. Whether it contains any lessons for us, etc., etc. So basically, these narratives, model theories, in short, they communicate some knowledge of the past. But there is still the past at the bottom. Then there is this level of narrative. But where do we get the knowledge of the past? It seems to me that there must be something in the middle. So let's move this level up and let's introduce another level. Once again, I will be quoting Jouni-Matti Kukkanen's book, or this is actually from the later paper. Jouni-Matti proposes that philosophers of history can focus also on this. The investigation of this process will in practice take the following form. How did the historian X arrive at his view of the past, given his argumentative context, the sources, and the text available to him? I have a name for this kind of project, microhistorical epistemology. I am actually very sympathetic to this approach, to study the inferential process, the argumentative structures historians employ when they are posing some claims about the past. As Jouni-Matti, I think you call this later text historiography, or historiography is claiming correctly that these are the rules that philosophers of history can focus on, and these are distinct from the level of representation somehow, or I'm not sure if Jouni-Matti would agree, I think not, and they are distinct from the past. So I think I cannot make it visible for you, unfortunately. Okay. Zoom is blocking me a bit. I will actually borrow different terms. I will borrow terms from Goldstein, I have already mentioned. For the rest of the presentation, I will call the top part of this scheme the superstructure of history, which Goldstein used for the part of historic enterprise that is visible to non-historian consumer. This is the level of narratives, of models, of video, of TV documentary literature. This is something that is meant for consumer. This is basically already communicated historical knowledge. On this middle level, Goldstein terms it infrastructure of history, which is the whole range of aspects, historical, and this is the aspect of the historical world that is not visible to the audience. This is actually interaction with evidence, comparing different evidence, making the inferences about the past. This is the level on which the historical knowledge is created. And the past, as we already said for Goldstein, it played no role in this scheme. So basically, we can say that on the superstructural level, we are mostly interested in some form of narrative analysis. On the infrastructural level, we are interested in the study of inferential structures. And on the lowest bar, we are interested in the metaphysics of the past. Actually, now when I'm looking at this free level, I'm getting PTSD because I have been teaching Hegel yesterday for 3 hours straight. So it scared me now, but I will try to show that this is not Hegelian at all. So how is this infrastructure, this inferential structure? What do we need to do in order to gain some knowledge of the past? Well, I think the easy answer is that we need some evidence. So here, these symbols represent historical evidence. You can see that these pictures are a little bit, in a bad shape, they are a little bit damaged, rusty, etc. And they are all lying on this one line. They are in the present. When you are looking at at two different artifacts, you can, without any additional theory, you cannot decide which is older and which is newer. Those are simply the objects in the present that you need to interact with and from which you derive some knowledge of the past. Simply, sorry for the long quotations, I will go quickly through it. There are some quotations from Goldstein about evidence. When we say that the starting point is the evidence, we mean only that the suspicion that there were events is suggested by the fact that there are present certain things which seem not fit into the present context of culture and life. Writings which most of us cannot read, coins which will buy nothing at the grocery, ruins of buildings, entire cities, and so on. So basically, we recognize evidence in something that is not fitting into our context of life. This is an interesting paragraph. Basically, Goldstein addressed some, I think, pretty commonsensical idea that the evidence is a trace of the past, and via inquiring into those traces, we should be able to get to the real past. But at the same time, he denies this option. And basically, he says that the real past is simply gone, it's inaccessible, we cannot get to it. We can only create different versions of historical past, some creation construct that explain the evidence, that can make sense of evidence. So Goldstein is standing pretty firm in his anti-realism, historical anti-realism. I've been also trying to, because you can see that I'm trying to a little bit compare positions of Goldstein and Jouni-Matti. Jouni-Matti, regarding evidence in historiography, in his 2021 text, states evidence in historiography, I think it can be anything, can be understood as anything that makes something reasonable to be believed. Especially in the context of historiographic discourse. So whatever historians can legitimately, within their discourse, use as evidence for any claim about the past is good enough evidence. So basically, evidence gets status as evidence from historical discourse. Nothing is evidence per se. You always need some theory for evidence to be evidence. So there is an essential theory-ladeness of evidence, and this theory is supplied by the historiographic discourse. That's at least how I understand Jouni-Matti's work. Here, this is the point I agree very much. I think Jouni-Matti is urging us to move beyond historical writing and focus on historiography as a research and argumentative practice. Once again, I think this is a good task. I should probably notice before I believe that Jouni-Matti would mention it himself, that actually he is not a big fan of Goldstein infrastructure superstructure distinction. He famously writes that distinction between superstructure and infrastructure is not solid because presentation is part of the justification of a historiographical work and therefore must be a subject to historiographic epistemology. I will try to show you how I understand this claim. So let's go back to our scheme. I'm not sure if everything will be visible actually now because of Zoom. So here you can see a scheme that I think would work well for both Goldstein's positions and Jouni-Matti's positions. On the top, I've wrote that it's a Renaissance market. It's a picture of a Renaissance market. It's some presentation model. It's simply a picture of a Renaissance market. It's something we can look at, and it can communicate to us some knowledge of the past. On the level of infrastructure, a lot of things are happening. Via the rules that historians subscribe to, via some established practices, something happens. Some evidence is disregarded because it's not found to be suited for the purposes of creating this representation. Some evidence is actually used in order to create different parts of this picture. It's used to substantiate different ways of presentation, etc., etc. At the same time, when I said Renaissance market, the obligatory concept Renaissance is, of course, something modern, something we created, something we want to present. And because we want to present Renaissance and we have to define Renaissance in certain manner, this Renaissance actually influences from the superstructure back to the infrastructure and actually tell us which evidence is relevant and which evidence is not relevant for any claims about Renaissance. That is at least how I understand claim that the infrastructure-superstructure distinction is not solid. And I think this is quite reasonably argued position that I think, yeah, historians can be influenced when they look for evidence via different conceptualizations from our contemporary times. But so this is how I imagine that Goldstein actually, maybe even Jouni-Matti imagines how historiography, historical knowledge is produced. You can see that what is the main factor there is actually historical practices, historical argumentation strategies on this infrastructural level, and the past is not particularly present, although I may be misinterpreting somebody who is sitting here, so I apologize for that if I do. So the contemporary rules of historical discourse and other theories guide the choice of evidence and resulting presentation. Correct claims are delineated by the accepted argumentative practices, and the picture on the top is actually not representation of the real past, but a construction based on historical practice and rules of discourse. I probably do not have a big problem with this position, even though I think the fact that the real past is completely missing from the scheme is somehow worrying. I would probably like to do something about that, so let's try. We will see if I am successful somehow. So the big problem in this is evidence, that the fact that evidence is theory-laden and it's something we cannot do anything with. Evidence simply must be identified by a theory. What is it evidence for, etc. On the other hand, historians are pretty adept to identify not only evidence for their theories, but they are very well adept at identifying traces of the past. We have some customs of collecting potential traces of the past, even if we have no theory or no specific theory about what this is evidence for. This is simply trace, and it is worth. It has some worth, it has some value, simply because it's a trace of the past. What is this value? Well, the value is its informational value. I would say that we can instead of evidence or trace, we can talk about the receivers of information, and these receivers receive information about its origins. And what the historians are really doing at one point is that they are decoding the information from the receiver, actually decoding the information from the past. So the past is suddenly present in this picture in some manner, and the theory of this, some theory that actually connects all three parts of the scheme is informational or information epistemology. It's actually an idea that I think is very well. You can find it in most of the works by Aviezer Tucker. So suddenly the past is populated by something. All those objects are in some way possible origins of information. This information from the origins is transmitted into the evidence. For example, there was a war. Somebody saw the war, somebody wrote about the war, and now we have the text speaking about the war. Information about the war was preserved in some way. So the origin is the event, and the information channel is somebody writing or recording an event, or some physical process that records the event, and the evidence is actually the receiver of this information, be it the text, be it some, let's say, even DNA or some artifact or something. Of course, the problem is that time is not very gentle with information, so there is always a noise, there is loss of information. Sometimes information from the origin does not even reach our present. So in a sense, Goldstein is right to say that the real past itself does not somehow play the role in our narrative, because what plays the role in our knowledge of the past is actually the information that reached us, not the past itself. But this is maybe far too specific. So the practices of historians often concern the act of information decoding and identifying origin. And as I said, historians, or Adrian Currie said historians are at the mercy of the processes by which time covers her tracks. So we have some concept of origination and information transmission on this level, and what historians are doing on the level of infrastructure, they are decoding that information, and they are comparing information, they are evaluating different pieces of evidence, they're making inferences about the past, and they infer some knowledge on the past on the level of the infrastructure. So you can see that there is suddenly the connection between the knowledge of the past is via the evidence connected to the origins of this information. This scheme can also help us to explain some other ways how historians actually arrive at knowledge, because sometimes it's not always, those are very specific examples, but sometimes absence of evidence can be informative as well. If we have sufficiently good theories that we would expect some information about something via different evidential channels, information channels, and we are lacking some information, this itself can be, for example, informative. In some cases, Elliot Solberg wrote a lot on this topic, for example. At the same time, this also gives us another scheme. How can we explain forged evidence? Because for forged evidence, let's imagine famous Czech manuscripts, Zelený and Králové Dvorsky, what I'm here, which claim that they originated in was it 10th century? Am I correct? Something like that. So they originated in the 10th century, and they are actually parasiting on the fact that historians can have some knowledge how to identify evidence from that era. So it's parasiting on that knowledge, it's mimicking that features. But when we are able to show that this past was not the real origin of that evidence, but the origin is much closer to the present, we can reevaluate this evidence, and we can then learn a lot about how 19th century intellectual environment actually supported this creation of forged evidence. So we have the knowledge of the past, and at this point, we won't be leaving information epistemology, because then at this point, it is actually information epistemology is still at its role, and historians need to communicate the knowledge they gained to the audience via the superstructure. Once again, there is another level of information transmission, but now it's not from it's from the past, but through historian who is adding some, let's say, noise, or maybe some additional insights, who is generating the knowledge and who is transmitting the knowledge. So knowledge of the past, it's transmitted by historians further in the form of narratives. This transmission follows another set of rules, some conventions, and can pursue various goals. So once again, what narrativist philosophers were doing was actually the study of these conventions and this level of information transition. So basically, we can say that on the lowest level, on the past, we need some theories about information preservation, about information destroying processes. We need theories that allow inferences of origins of informational channels. On the level of infrastructure, we need theories governing evaluation of evidence and related inferences, decoding of information, and knowledge generation. We also need some theories that will tell us something about analogous reasoning, which we need when we are substituting for the lost information in the case of absent evidence. And on the level of superstructure, we are talking about practices of knowledge transmission and retransmission, about narrative logic, about construction of models, about deriving lessons from the past and learning from the past. And through the superstructure of the history, we can also influence our present and future. And so now I'm basically coming to close. So now, once again, we can ask the question, where exactly the big history stands in this scheme. So big history is definitely some narrative, some theory about the past. So it's situated firmly there in the superstructure of history. And the past about which it is interested most is actually the past full of origins. The biggest origin, the original origin is the Big Bang. It's a big event that produced a lot of information, but it also destroyed all the information from the previous times. Philosophers of historical sciences like to liken Big Bang to the perfect crime, which leaves no trace of its what came before it. Also, big history is interested in the origins of many other facts of the present. We see it's interesting about the origin of complexity, origin of physical laws, origin of human society, origin of life. Basically, the big history, it's truly origin story in a way that it is trying to cover all the origin, and that's why the history is not interested in minute details, individual people, politicians, statesmen, kings, or whatever. It's ultimately a really origin story. And as for the infrastructure of history, it's truly a modern origin story in a way that it's entirely reliant on modern ways of decoding information, modern ways of how we handle information transmission. And it's not similar to other older types of writing history, which consisted mostly from copy and paste approach, simply rewriting what earlier chronicles wrote about certain times, or it's not reliant on folk psychology when we are trying to explain the behavior of historical agents in terms of fears, motives, etc., etc. It's using these modern approaches, but at the same time, it is a story or a myth. It can coexist with other alternative accounts, which are nevertheless important because they do not share this originary or modern approaches to telling the story of the past. So basically, I believe this scheme can explain what the history is doing. This scheme is applicable both to historical sciences, from which it's mostly derived, but I think it's also potentially useful in order to explain our practices in the field of human history and historiography. And I believe what I hope that are useful points from it is that actually I think it captures and retains all the important insights made by numerous philosophers of history. I think it retains a lot of insights and all of the points made and leveled by anti-realist, realist, and other groups of philosophers. It combines those, I think, important insights into one particular framework, and I think it still retains coherency and can be useful as a shared framework between history for philosophers of history and philosophers of historical sciences. So that would be all. Thank you very much.
So thank you for your detailed and interesting talk. And now it's time to open the discussion. So are there any questions? Yeah, please.
Looking at some evidence and interpretively creating these like stories or narratives. Sometimes evidence is pretty self-explanatory. Like I'm thinking like, let's do the iceberg, you know. From the Neolithic period, we find this corpse that is like perfectly preserved, and we can see that okay, it was shot by arrows. And we can even tell the motive that was not material because he had some good quality tools on him. And if the motive was like robbery or something, he wouldn't have the tools left on him. So, okay, we can look at the content of his stomach and say, oh, he ate this and this, because it would be really weird that if somebody came and put half-digested food down his throat after he eats that. So, okay, we can infer that like he sort of ate this meal. So there isn't much room to create this sort of story. Like we can see the tattoos on his body that he had tattoos. So there isn't that like big jump. And I don't think like in every case we can apply that, okay, history like this process of like construction, because some things that we can observe.
Okay, can I get back to one of the points at the beginning? You said that those inferences are relatively simple.
Yeah.
Well, I think they are pretty complex actually. I think you already said like you see that he had the tools of good quality. In order to say that these tools were of comparatively good quality from that time period you are, for example, describing, you need a lot of additional insight, additional information about that period. Without other tools, you cannot claim that these tools were of good quality. You already imply that you have a pretty lot of information about what the quality of the tools at that period was. So I think neither of these inferences you said are simple. I would totally disagree. I will totally disagree with you. I think you are making a lot of very difficult, very complex inferences that are dependent on a large amount of data, a large amount of theories that you need to interpret them. So I think I would disagree that it's as simple as you claim.
Yes, yeah, there's an inference in that, but like, let's say we can also observe that we have like certain diseases, and we can compare it to the like conditions and how they present today, and like we see the exact same thing in the body. So then like we don't even need to refer to some historical knowledge, and we can observe that, oh, he had this disease, because like it's directly observable. Like again.
I think I would be quite well, once again, in order to observe some disease, you need the knowledge of diseases. I think there is a lot of theory involved within all of this. So I would probably disagree that this, even if it would be simple, at what point it actually maybe I somehow struggle to understand how it exactly counters my view of epistemology of historical sciences, even if those were very simple observations.
Well, I believe some things in history that we can be pretty sure of, like just based on like simple narrative. Okay, there are arrows in this body. He was killed by arrow. Like, I think that's pretty simple. And like, just like with the narrative creation, I don't think there's a narrative creation that like when we observe there are little arrows in the body that he was killed by arrows.
Am I correct? Now you're talking about Otzi Mame?
Yeah.
It's some time I have actually spent some time reading about it. Wasn't it the case that actually the arrowheads in his body were interesting in a way that the tissue around the arrowheads were regenerated to some level? So after some time they learned that he wasn't killed by certain arrows that actually...
He had like certain old arrow wounds and like new ones.
But once again, it's getting more and more complicated. Like the very fact that you find the arrow in somebody does not mean that the person was killed by that arrow. I think there is a lot of theoretical background going on, and I think we should be explicit about it as much as possible in order to truly appreciate what goes on within historical inference. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a next question, and please use your microphone.
Okay.
Can I just, do you hear? Thank you. Thanks, David. I just actually wanted to have a follow-up on this and maybe some other questions later, because it is an interesting question. But even if you have those holes in his body, I don't think you can make a sure inference that he died because of that. It's still underdetermined. I don't know how much work has been done, in fact, to ascertain that he died because of that. But then, more importantly, it's the issue, I think, what also David is talking about, what the history writing is about. It's not only about determining the cause of death of this one person, but actually then you would want to make something more. Maybe then comes to this narrative structures. What was he doing? What was his life about? What was he going about? Even what's the meaning of his life? What's his society and so on? And you can have basically infinite number of questions, and then you always need some sort of inferences on some kind of reasoning and on some type of basis, and it gets more complicated. And there I think we get into this kind of issues of how to produce, how to construct, sometimes I use what's the logic, if there's a logic of historiography. Can we have a logic, sort of rule-based way to infer all the way up to get to a long textual account of the past? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. This is another level. Once again, I was focusing more on the, let's say, my infrastructure level. How do we make these inferences? And Jouni-Matti, I think, focused very nicely on what other inferences can be used in order to narrate, explain, or create some bigger narrative from it. So, yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah,
I can go. I wanted to ask because I'm not sure if I ever seen your picture of how the infrastructure and superstructure work, and it's quite interesting. I may need to study and think about it further. So now, just one simple question is, what is knowledge? What does it mean when you have knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
In history or in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, I think, a good question, and that's something I really need to think through. I have been really using knowledge, I think I haven't reflected enough, because now I'm feeling entrapped. I would say like it's a justified true belief or something like that. Let's say I would say it's a justified probable belief. Also sounds stupid, but that's some of a direction I would like to go, probably. It's also probably the theory that best explains the evidence we have at hand, which is a more pragmatic approach. I think you might be. Yeah, for me, I'm still a little bit undecided on that level, because I always had a problem with Goldstein account that simply evidences something purely theory-laden. I think in order to have a really substantiated discussion within history, the historians are really arguing whether evidence is informative about the past. And I think this is an argument we ought to have. So I would lean towards getting some elements of realism in my theory, but also I have been vastly influenced by Goldstein. I have been strong anti-realist before, so I'm still gravitating. I think, yeah, even if I go fully, let's say, information is transferred to the evidence is a receiver. Information about the real origin. We are discussing on the real path. I'm also sympathetic to that. At the same time, always the anti-realist within me always starts complaining. Okay, but we still, it's wholly dependent on the theories we have for decoding the evidence. There is still some room for these doubts, but I'm not fully decided by that. I feel that I'm moving towards realism from my previously anti-realist standpoint. But I think there are still things I need to think through more. So I think it was not fully satisfactory question, but that's the way how it is now, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And what about other questions or follow-ups? Yeah, please.
Nobody else is about it. Another 10.
I think it was somebody
else first.
Is it fine?
Yeah.
Okay, so please continue.
Just go to this slide down. So
Please use Michael.
Because I see this slide. So are you suggesting to introduce a new tripartite differentiation of superstructure, infrastructure, and the past? I find it's a bit incongruent because, of course, the past is a sort of a metaphysical category, and the other two are whatever we call them, epistemic categories, or perhaps categories that apply to historiographic research and perhaps to the end product. And even when you talk about the past, you mostly talk about evidence, which again is an epistemic category. I do understand we need the past somehow to have evidence, because if there was no causal relation from the past to the evidence, we could not know about the past. If there was no information transmitted, so we need the past somehow. We need some metaphysical background of it. But does the past fit in this? Is this the third level that somehow needs to be introduced?
I think that question, well, I think what is important is the fact that we need to say that the evidence contains some information about the past. So we somehow need to introduce, in order to work in the past, it needs to be introduced. It might not be introduced in this like flashy manner. This is simply a scheme, which is simply very abstract model, and I was guided by some logic of creating models. So maybe but I think the past needs to be reintroduced into the picture a little bit in order to, for example, if we are really looking at the practices of historians, a lot of the debates are revolving about the informative value of certain pieces of evidence. A lot of the methods of historians are concerned with increasing the information value of evidence, like ancient DNA enrichment, because a lot of ancient DNA is in such state that it's not informative unless some additional processes are undertaken in order to enrich its informative value. So I think historians, if we truly look at their practices and how they work, so they are using this information theory more and more, and it's in the background of what they are doing. Whether this scheme can be drawn in other way, I think it definitely can be.
Okay, thank you. And Preston?
So I'll first say, just as a Hegelian, that makes perfect sense to me. You've got the in itself, the for itself, and then the in and for itself. So that just seems right. That was a joke.
Hegelian, so.
What I want to ask is about a claim you make, and I'm not sure if I just misunderstood the scope, but you said it toward the middle that historical narratives are a contemporary construction. Do you just mean that historical narratives come after the fact, or that people weren't engaging in historical narratives before, like, the contemporary period?
I would say that in order to construct historical narrative, you need to benefit from hindsight. You need to stand after the event. You're looking retrospectively on something. So of course, like, historical narratives were made in the past.
Okay.
And also, quite often, even example, as I told you, that for example, we can either put David Hume's History of England to the top. It's a narrative of the past. It's a superstructure. But at the same time, it can function in different type of questioning. It can function as an evidence. For example, when I am discussing the practices of writing history in 18th century Scotland or England, then of course David Hume's History of England is a piece of evidence, and it harbors additional information, not only information about the past, like about the past which David Hume is actually writing about, but about the 18th century. So I think this is we can still move the things around within the scheme, always answer in relation to our research question.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Philip had a question.
Very inspiring presentation. Thank you. So I assume when you have this figure of the past, you are already a realist. Do you agree?
I think it can be said, but I think I have been trying to be quite careful about one thing. I have been trying. These are not the entities in the past. These are the origins of informational channels. This is not I wouldn't say that this is like the pre-structured path.
I assume anti-realist would have plurality of paths, for example.
I'm sorry?
That anti-realist would have plurality of the past. So there would be plural, for example. So I mean, I am sympathetic to your approach. My question is like purely theoretical. Another question would be, so from the position of classic, let's say, philosophy of science, I don't know, Kuhn, Popper, do you think that there is something really different epistemological from, I mean, the debates about the position of natural sciences, realism, anti-realism. So do you think that there is something structurally different in these debates about history, philosophy of history?
I think
maybe, excuse me, maybe simple question. So can you be realist about, let's say, biology and anti-realist about historiography of biology? Would this make sense?
Yeah, this is a question I would need to think about more. I can imagine that, for example, when you are inquiring into past life, past geology, let's say paleontology, you have some evidence, some traces of the life. Then you have basically you have evidence, you have a trace, you have information about the individual one individual, let's say one piece of dinosaur. You have information about one particular individual dinosaur, and then from that you use it as a semaphoron within some theory. Semaphoron into the theory, and you extrapolate some idea about the species. But the species is definitely constructed category, so you can I think, and you can then try to pursue some anti-realist approach to how the species are constructed. I'm not sure if I'm making really sense, because it's some questions I really don't think much about most of the time. But I think there can be like I'm sure that this dinosaur, whose bones I'm holding within my hand, walked the earth this many years ago, but now I'm making claims about the species, and the species I'm talking about is a theoretical construct to some degree. But yeah, I'm not sure if this is a good answer, but I'm trying to, as you challenged me to create a combination of a realist and a realist theory. Does it work? I don't know.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And please.
Let me make a suggestion here. I think you can divide the past into three parts.
Okay.
No, not really. That will help you answer these questions. First, you can use the little-known English word that has Greek etymology, ylem, Y-L-E-M. As everybody can Google it. It exists. And it's from the Greek, from a shapeless mass that is the origin of everything. Now, that would be the broadest concept of the past. It's this shapeless mass. We know nothing about it, and it's just there. It just was. Within this ylem, you can have the past that actually sent information to the present that survived. But the fact that it sent information to the present doesn't mean necessarily that it was deciphered. And then within that, there is the past that sent information to the present, and that information has already been deciphered with a high degree of probability, and that's what we call knowledge of the past, historiography, and so on. Now, what historians don't know is what is the gap between what they know and what they may know, if they had better theories, if they looked for more diligently for relevant evidence and so on. And then the gap between the information that was sent and the information, and the past is pretty much lost. That we will never know, and that's most of the past, of course. We can know absolutely nothing about. It's just this shapeless mass of things. So the answer, what is the knowledge, is the more what we know is number 3. What we can know is number 2. What actually happened is number 1.
Yes. Yeah. We'll give it more thought. Thank you.
Sorry?
I will give it more thought, and we can discuss it a little bit later. I think it could.
Well, I think we have a time for one last question. So if there is one. Okay, so yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is there no one else? Okay. Yeah, I now come back to this picture. And I don't see the realism, other than maybe some fig leaf realism that the past is somewhere, but we really don't, some kind of behind the Kantian transcendental limit. What I see there, at least not realism in the epistemological sense, because I would read this, that knowledge is in the practice. You have knowledge when this inferences has been done correctly. And then if we become obvious view that there's some gap, if it's one day close the gap, then that would be sort of a Peircean idea of at the ideal limit of knowing when all evidence has been factored in, and it's almost like certain that we make this inference, but that's an ideal limit. So my reading is that it's in the practice, including inferential practice, although I would include to having knowledge, you also have to have a discursive practice as a historian and also as a textual. But that's, this of course depends on what are those figures in the past box. You said they are origins, but what are origins? Origin sources, what did you say?
Origins are origins of information. Those are the start of the information channels that.
So it can be, what, for example, can it be just anything that?
It could be event, it could be thought, it could be action.
Okay, so it's not like, because one option is it would be like a material traces, for example, which needs then conceptualization what they are actually before you can draw an inference.
For example, if we let's say look at this particular line, I wasn't giving it much thought when I was choosing the symbols actually. Let's say this is some widely held belief in the past. Is it material or not? Let's say because there is a comics bubble. So let's say some widely held belief from the past was preserved within oral tradition.
But I'm just
this way of preserving would be very, very dubious. It would be a lot of the information would be lost. It would be mixed with noise. It would be but there would be some information.
But word representing that graphically would be in the form of waves. That each, like a stone that you throw in the pond, waves spread. Many of them disappear after a while. One becomes quiet. You don't see the waves anymore. But what you can show is some of the waves reach the infrastructure. Others just kind of fade away within the past, and they never get to the part of Cleland.
Okay, so the next phase of improving the scheme more and more would be instead of lines do.
Yeah, good way.
Okay. Good.
One more, because the issue, if I think about it very practically, like if I'm a historian asked to work like this, and I'm not sure if I can infer from a widely held belief, because I had to infer first that there was a widely held belief. And when do I infer that from? I infer that from maybe some archives and documents or literature of the time, or maybe even furniture. I don't know, but I have to first come to that judgment.
Yes.
And then maybe a further inference.
So let's say there's some oral tradition. That stories about Vodnik. Water goblin, and this is some fairy tales for kids today in the poems or in the oral tradition. My grandmother was telling me about Vodnik, etc., etc. This is somehow related to some mythological belief from the past, which was probably widely held enough, so it still was. But it's highly unlikely that much of the oral tradition today about vodniks really inform us about what is like. A lot of the information was lost. A lot of it was mixed in with noise. A lot of it is basically lost to us, but it still has some informative value for us, nevertheless.
The water spirit is the problem. The question is whether it maintains some content from the pagan period of Christianity around all these generations, or whether it's a later invention, or whether it's just copied from some German mythology, the most humiliating